tolerance is who is the I that we've been speaking about. So often we speak about the I or the you and what you're about and what you want. And the question is, who's the real I? And there's a lot of depth to this question. I want to hear from Laurence herself what exactly she meant by that question. But I want to say that I was contemplating what route to take when addressing this question. I think there's so much to discuss, and there's a lot of nuance and detail and a lot to get into. And I had a kind of like a choice between going from step one, like really starting from the bottom and building it up, maybe over a course of classes, but being that I wanted each class to be itself. So I chose to do a different route, which is to kind of jump right into the middle and talk about something which you really needs a lot of background, but we're just going to talk about it and we'll try to give it over. I think it has, weight for itself. And then hopefully in the future classes, we will go backwards a little bit and revisit some of the depth or how we got there or some of the background to it. So this is a little bit of the skeleton, but I think we'll be able to give over enough that you'll walk away feeling like you've learned something. So with that said, I want to ask by asking you, what do you think of when you hear the question, who am I? Or who is I? Is that a question that talks to you? Do you have questions on that? What is the question if it talks to you? Or you're just not sure what the question is at all?
I'm not sure what the question is.
Okay. Laurence, do you want to explain a little bit?
I've been hearing, okay. A lot of people talk about the I am. And I, for a long time, I had no idea what that meant. And that's what I've been exploring. Who is the I am? I am that I am, is what I've heard so many times. And I think I'm starting to taste it. Like, who is the I am?
So this is because of your work that you do.
Yeah, of my other stuff. So, and I want to know it, not just understand it.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Where is that sort of like coming from? Because I guess to me, there's all stuff that goes on because I was a purpose coach. And that's part of who I am or who you are or what you're looking for. But yours sounds a little more deeper.
It's way deeper.
Yeah. So explain to
Like
me.
I was a doctor for 30 years. That's not who I am. The I am that I am is like a deep, my essence, my truth.
Okay.
That's what that is to me.
Okay. Do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I really, but when I saw the topic and you texted me, I wasn't really quite sure, but just the comment that you just made, I was a doctor, but that's not who I am. That's an interesting thing to think about deeper, right? I'm not defined by maybe my profession or degree or something I do, but some of the deeper meaning or drive or, yeah.
Or maybe we do define ourselves by our profession, and that's something to think about. Should we define ourselves
the way we
by our profession?
I'm not sure, but it's an interesting question to think about.
The Rebbe would sometimes tell people by dollars. He would say, I'm a doctor, I'm a lawyer. The Rebbe said, that's what you do. I'm asking you, who are you?
That's right.
You're a father, you're a husband, you're whatever else whatever you identify as, that identity. How do you identify? So let's delve a little bit into that. And again, there's a lot of things to address, but I'm going to go into one path, and then hopefully in the future classes we will maybe, I don't know if it's going to be the next class or just future classes, we will see other paths. So the way I want to go into this is based on the Tanya. The Tanya is a book written by the first Chabad Rebbe, Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi. Anyone heard of the Tanya before? No? So this is a new book that I mentioned. It's a book that I think people should read, worthwhile reading. It's the first book written by the Chabad Lubavitch movement. So Chabad Lubavitch, most people know it as an organization with Chabad houses that help Jewish people, but essentially it's a movement with a theology based on the Kabbalah, based on Hasidic philosophy, but a specific take in Hasidic philosophy called Chabad, which is about understanding, about using the brain to come to God. And the very first book was written by the first Chabad Rebbe, the Alter Rebbe, and he wrote a book called the Tanya, and he writes in his introduction, people are coming to me with all sorts of questions about service of God. I don't have enough time to address all these questions, so I'm writing a book that's going to answer all your questions.
How long ago was it written?
This is written 250 years ago,
Is it on Amazon?
200 years ago. It's a very, very, very useful book. You could find it on Amazon.
Yeah, so the Chabad movement started about 200 years ago.
250 years ago, yes.
Okay.
And the book has a number of parts to it, but the vast majority of the book is 53 chapters, which discuss the makeup of the human being, namely the soul, and the struggle that the person experiences, and what that struggle is all about, what the purpose of the struggle is, and how to deal with that struggle. And that itself could be, divided into many ways. And again, if you're interested in doing more research into this, I could give you ideas of various books to buy. There's hundreds of commentaries that have been written on the Tanya since it's been written. Is there?
There's a cliff note to the Old Testament.
Oh, sure.
On
Reader's Digest.
Chabad.org itself, you could
You can
find
it there.
a number of translations on the Tanya. So I want to begin on this paper. You'll see the Tanya, the Book of Two Souls, chapter 3, chapter 4, and chapter 6. I'm going to begin, I'd like to mention a few jokes.
Yeah.
So there was the joke that I mentioned in the past. The one from Jackie Mason does this little spiel where the guy comes to the psychiatrist, and the psychiatrist says, I'll tell you your problem. I'll tell you what your problem is. Your problem is that you got a split personality. You got two halves of yourself. And that's going to be $100. So the guy says, well, psychiatrist, I'll tell you the problem. The problem is that if there's two me and I'm not sure who I am, and I'm not sure who you are, maybe you're me and I'm you, and maybe you owe me $100. Right? So that was the Jackie Mason. And then there was the joke about the guy that came to the psychiatrist. And the psychiatrist told him that you got a split personality. He said, well, in that case, could I get a group discount? Okay, so the Alter Rebbe actually tells us that we have two souls. And the reason why that's so powerful is because often we end up feeling like, who am I? Meaning, sometimes in life we feel very selfish. Sometimes in life we feel like it's all about me and running after my desires and running after, things like that. And sometimes we could feel very spiritual and very connected and very about giving and about helping others and being there for others. And the question is, who am I? And Alter Rebbe says, you aren't one or the other. You actually have two souls. And you could choose on any given moment between those two souls. Or sometimes people will like to call it a body versus a soul. But maybe we'll get into that at a different time. Again, we have to take a specific path here, so I don't want to get too deep into it. Ultimately, we'll discover in later classes that there's really three souls, three personality types that we each inherently have. But for now, we'll just discuss two souls. And let's dive straight into these two souls. So in chapter 2 of the Tanya, the Alter Rebbe introduces the second soul, namely the godly soul. We each have within us a piece of God. This is what he says. We have a piece of God. This is the godly soul. And that piece of God just wants to connect to God. That's what it inherently is about connecting to God. And then in chapter 3 and 4, he goes on to discuss the properties of this soul. And he tells us that this soul has intellect, it has emotion, and it also has what we spoke about last week. It has the clothing, which is thought, speech, and action. The tools that are used to express whether it's the intellect or that emotion. So let us begin in text 3. And I'm going to ask Joanne if you could read for us. chapter 3, the first paragraph.
Now, the divine soul consists of 10 faculties. The 10 faculties of the soul are divided into 2 categories, intelligence and emotions. The emotions are love of God, awe, and reverence towards Him, a drive to glorify and praise Him, as well as others along the same lines.
Okay, so he told us that there's 10 faculties of the soul, but generally speaking, these 10 faculties are split into 2, 3 and 7, 3 intellectual faculties, and 7 emotional faculties. All our emotions are one of these 7, are included in one of these 7. Okay, continue on.
Interesting. Okay. It starts when your divine soul's mind engages in a very deep contemplation of God's greatness, how He pervades all worlds, how He transcends all worlds, or how everything might as well be nothing relative to Him. When you do this, a sense of reverence is born in your mind. This newborn awareness awakens, affecting your thoughts, filling you with a sense of awe and embarrassment from God's greatness, because it is greatness without end. Palpable fear of God begins to throb in your heart, and then your heart ignites in love as fierce as a flaming fire, yearning, desiring, longing, a soul longing for the greatness of the infinite. This describes the birthing of the emotions of awe and love. The rest of the divine soul's emotions are branches and offshoots of those as discussed elsewhere.
Okay, so this is interesting. The Alter Rebbe is telling us the map of how the soul works. Why does the soul have intellect? Why does the soul have emotions? And the answer is because the intellect brings about emotion. And how does intellect bring about emotion? Because through intellect we could think about God, we can understand God, we can understand God's greatness, we could contemplate God's greatness. And by thinking about the greatness of God, we come to bear emotions, feelings towards God, whether it's going to be a love for God, whether it's going to be a fear for God, an awe for God, right? These are feelings that are born from the intellect. And this describes the 10 faculties of the soul in a very general term. Obviously, there's much more detail to it, but in very generally speaking, there's 3 aspects of the mind, which are about understanding God, and then there's 7 aspects of the heart, which are about feeling God or feeling for God, having an emotional relationship with God. Okay, does anyone have any questions on this? Or you're all lost?
Isn't it all 7 and 3?
There's a
Well, I'm glad you set that straight. That's very.
Is there any reason why it's divided into 7 and 3?
So I could talk about the details. I'm not going to go into that now. Meaning, there's physically speaking, there's 3 compartments of our brain,
Okay.
right? You know that.
Okay,
Maybe. So in Kabbalah, which we'll go into, that there's 3 types of thinking. So there's wisdom, understanding, and knowledge. That's the general translation of the Chabad, Chachma, Bina, Das, the 3 parts of our brain. And then there's 7 emotional aspects, which is Chesed, Gvura, Tiferes, Netzach, Hod, Yesod, Malchus, kindness, discipline, mercy, perseverance, victory, connection, and giving. That's very loosely translated of the 7 emotions. Okay, any more questions? Because I think there's a lot to ask on this, but
there's tons.
anyone want to ask a question on this? So I'll just ask the question, and I think this is the question that might be on your mind, which is, as far as I'm concerned, intellect is a tool, an open tool, to be used to understand. To understand what? Anything. No one's going to say my intellect is a math brain. Maybe my brain is more geared to math, but could I not move it over to science if I train it to understand science? Meaning it's the tool of observation. It's the tool of being objective. And objectivity exists in whatever world it chooses to be objective. So I would think it's very odd to say that the intellect of the godly soul is to understand God. So does it not understand that 2 + 2 = 4? How does that make any sense? What are we trying to say? How could you say that the intellectual tool, the intellectual mind, is subjective to a specific type of intellect?
Yes, my question would be, if you're saying that there's the godly soul and the like more bodily.
Animal
whatever.
soul, or
Sure.
we'll talk about that.
My question would be, does the godly soul manifest in your day to day in the same way that your animal soul does? For example, like I want to eat this apple, right?
That's a
Like,
great question.
It's a very deliberate like action. Whereas if you're saying like the intellect of the godly soul is to understand God, I probably don't feel that in the same way that I do that I understand that I want to eat this apple.
That's a great question. Could you try to hold on to that question for the end of the class? Maybe write it down, because I hope if we have time, I want to get back to that question, but I don't want to get to it now.
Yeah.
But does my question make sense?
You're saying that the intellect of the divine soul is to understand God, right?
Yes, that's what he says.
Okay.
And
To me,
then,
that might mean an experience of God.
okay. Okay,
That's
but
the
is
way
that
to
is that the
understand.
power of wisdom, understanding, and knowledge? The soul has the power of experience, which is probably beyond intellect, but the soul also has the power to understand something, the power to analyze, the power to observe. Wisdom, understanding, and knowledge.
Of course.
Again, but could it not understand regular mundane life? Could it not understand that the apple has nutrients?
Like what capacity does it have?
Right? And the same question I'm going to have going
Right, so
further.
like, is it a single intellect that just singly focused on understanding God, or right,
Or is it the ability of
does
intellect?
have the ability, right, to
Right.
comprehend or think about anything?
Yeah, like if you had a spoon and you liked soup, would you say that this spoon eats soup? You would say that I have a spoon which could do many things. I'm going to use it for soup.
Right.
But it's a spoon for all practical purposes. And the same thing is in terms of the emotions. He says that the love of the godly soul is to love God, and the fear of the godly soul is to have fear and awe for God. Does that actually make any sense? I would think that emotions are a part of the soul, a part of our personality, which feels closeness and feels distant, right? Feels removed. Those emotions are open-ended for anything that we might feel that about. It could be about God, it could be about something else. Maybe if I'm focused on God, I'll think I'll have that for God. But could you describe the emotion as that? Could you say, my love is a love for God? Right? Later on, the Alter Rebbe poses a different question. He talks about the love that we inherit from our forefathers, from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We inherit from them a love for God. And he asks this very question. He says, you could love a friend with all your heart, and all your soul, and all your might. Your child is not necessarily going to have that love for that person. They might inherit the attribute of love, but that love, meaning the feeling to feel close to somebody, that has to be cultivated, that it's geared towards that person. So it might be for that person, it might be for someone else, but the emotional experience is open-ended. So how could I limit it and say the love of the godly soul is a love for God? Again, I think this is a simple question, and this is gonna, I think, give us insight on what the godly soul is all about, perhaps. But my question is going to go even further with chapter 4, and I'm going to have you read chapter 4. Here, again, I took out a little snippet of the chapter, but he discusses, now that we know that we have 10 faculties, how do we express those 10 faculties? So he says we each have 3 tools, and that is thought, speech, and action. Let's see inside.
In addition to her 10 faculties, every divine soul has 3 flows. The powers of verbal thought, speech, and action by which she engages in the 613 mitzvahs of the Torah.
Okay, so again, we see a very interesting thing, which she says that the godly soul has the power to express its intellect and emotion through thought, speech, and action. And what is the thought, speech, and action? Thought, speech, and action of Torah and mitzvot. Right? And he goes on at length to talk about the thought being thinking about Torah and thinking about the love for God, as he spoke about earlier in the previous chapter, and the speech being, davening and other things that are mitzvot, and the action being any mitzvah action, putting on tefillin, lighting Shabbos candles. These are the actions of the divine soul, of the godly soul. And the question is, even more so, thought, speech, and action are open-ended capabilities. So how would I define the thought, speech, and action of the godly soul as a thought for Torah, or a thought for doing a mitzvah. When seemingly a thought is a thought, anything can be put into that thought, whether it's chosen to be used in that vicinity of life, then that's fine. But that's not what it is inherently. How could we define it inherently as that? Okay, this is the question that I posed. Make sense?
Mhm.
You have any thoughts on that?
Not right now.
Not right now. Okay. Okay, I was supposed to go to the next slide. What?
Why is the pronoun her?
Yeah,
The-
it's the first time we
the
see
soul?
she.
Yeah.
The soul is always considered a her.
Is it?
Yes.
In
Especially, the soul is always considered a her, especially in terms of the way the soul comes down into the body. The soul definitely, in regards to God, is the receiver. God is the giver, she's the receiver. So that's why God is usually a him and she's usually a her, even though they're interchangeable, meaning depending on the context. The body, compared to the soul, would be a female to a male, because the body is the receiver of the soul. The words female and male in these contexts are used based on who's the receiver and who's the giver. Okay.
Also, when you say, like you were saying the actions of the Torah, right?
Yes.
Where you're saying like a mitzvah is to light the candle.
Mhm.
You also said earlier that like the Alter Rebbe sees the two souls as you choose between one at one time. Could you not be experiencing both? At
You
the same
definitely
time?
do experience both at the same time, which goes back to your previous question that you asked me. So again, I'll talk about that at length later.
Yeah.
But definitely, that's a very good point. Our godly soul, this is something that the Alter Rebbe says explicitly, our godly soul needs our animal soul to express itself in this world. Okay, well, again, that's maybe beyond the scope of this conversation, or maybe within the scope. We'll see based on our time. Okay, now we're on to chapter 6, which finally we're getting to know the soul, which we know much more, which the Alter Rebbe calls the animal soul, or our other self, and he doesn't really talk about it much. He simply says it's kind of the same as the godly soul, but with animalistic terms. Okay, so Laurence, do you want to read for us chapter 6?
Just as the divine soul consists of 10 faculties and is clothed in 3 garments, the thought, speech, and action of Torah and the mitzvah, so too the soul of sitra,
Sitra, achra, the other side. We'll talk about that soon.
consists of 10. These 10 faculties are 7 evil emotional traits and the intellect.
Okay, so I'll point out a few things here. Number one is he just compares them. He says that the godly soul, there's the animal soul. The godly soul has 10 parts, intellect and emotion. The animal soul also has 10 parts, intellect and emotion. Now, is there anything that screamed at you when you read this paragraph? Evil. Okay, that sounds pretty intense. That sounds pretty evil.
Yeah.
Pretty sinister. Pretty now fear. Like, why are you calling them evil? Okay, so he says evil emotion. Another thing that I want to point out is he mentions the emotions before the intellect. Where in terms of the godly soul, he mentioned the intellect before the emotions. I'm not sure if we'll have time to get into that, but that's a very important point. You want to take us to the next paragraph? This is continuing chapter 6.
Now, when a person thinks of ways of obtaining something he desires or speaks words originating from them, or does an act which serves or expresses them, then the thought in his brain, the words in his mouth, and the power of action in his hands and other organs are called impure garments. These garments of the animal soul comprise of mundane actions, which are all vanity and an affliction of the spirit. For this is the meaning of the term sitra.
Sitra, achra.
Literally the other side. For example, not the side of holiness. The side of holiness is nothing but the indwelling and extension of God's holiness.
Okay, so this is very intense or extreme. The Alter Rebbe says, so just to again give context to what's going on here, the first paragraph of chapter 6 that I brought here spoke about the intellect and emotions of the animal soul. The second paragraph spoke about those garments, the thought, speech, and action of the animal soul. And it defined both of them as evil, and the opposite of holiness, impure, vanity and affliction of the spirit. He says holiness is anything which gives room for God, anything which is connected to God. While the animal soul is not about God, it's about itself, and therefore it's evil. So one thing that, so first of all, I'm going to address the elephant in the room, which is that seems very intense. That seems like not fair to say. I don't think anyone in the world would define evil as being about yourself, not being about God.
Can I say something?
Sure.
It's I'm reading that, and to me, what it says is that the evil is the ego.
Okay.
I'm relating it to your ego.
Okay, that's
really
great.
what your ego is. Your ego is in terms of yourself.
Sure.
And so it's not necessarily positive. We don't want to define it as evil because you want to say you're evil. But
Yeah, that's a good point, right? So I think what Brian is saying is that if you want to say what he said in other words, he says that evil is your ego, or evil is your selfishness, versus your selflessness would be your goodness. And then the question would be, is that really evil? When you go to a psychologist, they know that who you are at the end of the day is your ego. Is ego a bad thing, or ego is who you are? Ego, talk about ego and it sounds really scary. Well, if someone is unhealthily egoistic, then that would be a bad thing. But generally, the concept of survival, the concept of being about myself and protecting myself, I think that's what life is about. Is there more to life? And that's something that I want to explore here. So before I get to that, one other thing I wanted to point out about this chapter 6 is, as much as it's extreme, and maybe it sounds, I'm not thinking of the right word, radical, that's the word I'm looking for. The thing that I appreciate about chapter 6, everyone has a favorite chapter in Tanya, and most people it's not chapter 6. But for me, in a way, it is chapter 6. And the reason is, usually it's more something which more is applicable and rational, and there's a lot of beautiful chapters of Tanya. But to me, the reason why chapter 6 is so amazing is because in life, we very rarely have clarity between good and evil. So as much as it's radical, but it's clear. And what I mean is, if you look in terms of society, we live in a world that's a good world, and it wasn't always like that. And generally, generally speaking, we adhere to we try to be good people, and we have terms and guidelines of what goodness is about, and what a proper, healthy relationship is about, etc. And etc. But if you look in history, the line keeps on changing. And when you were a child in my day and age, the guideline between good and evil, the guideline between a healthy relationship and unhealthy relationship, or what's considered too boastful, or what's considered too egoistic, or what's considered too self-centered, keeps on moving.
It's very subjective, depending on society.
Society, right? And if I were to ask you, what is the guideline? Give me a clear guideline. Don't tell me like, is that good or is that evil? I think it's good today. I think it might be evil today. And part of the issue with not having a clear guideline is, I think that's where things like World War II happen. Meaning you have a society which considers itself a good society and it's kind to animals, but because it doesn't have a clear guideline, it came to a place to rationalize killing out a human race. Because the guidelines of good and evil are not clear. This is one of the reasons why the Rebbe was pushed so much, that it's important to share the basics of human decency from a godly perspective. And the Rebbe pushed that there should be what's called a moment of silence in public schools, because there used to be a moment of prayer in public schools, and then they took that out because of the separation between church and state, and the Rebbe wanted a moment of silence. And the moment of silence, which many states have that. I think Florida has it, Texas has it, I believe. And the moment of silence is that the teacher tells the students that this is a time for you to think about whatever your parents taught you. So we're not putting any religion on you, we're not putting anything on you, but hopefully your parents gave you a certain awareness of a greater power, of that there's an eye that looks at you and an ear that hears you. And the reason why that's so important is because if we don't have a realm of decency from a higher power, there's no guidelines.
Well, that's why I did my big shop.
And there's no real morale. And unfortunately, we've seen terrible things that have happened with murders and other things from people that weren't necessarily coming from bad places, but they didn't have a proper guideline, and maybe they got their education from television and other areas that are not the best place to be educated. And if you don't have a guideline of good and evil, there is no guidelines. Everything is up for discussion. And that's why, to me, chapter 6 is very powerful. But moving right along, I wanted to introduce something which is much more day and age, and maybe you would more appreciate it for now, which is called IFS. Does anyone know about IFS? Is that something that you're aware of?
Yeah.
So IFS is a psychology take, the path in psychology, which was introduced fairly recently by a man that lives today by the name of Dr. Richard Schwartz, a Jewish man, beautiful man. You'll see him in a moment. Very, very, good person, clearly very good person. And it's become very widespread, very, very widespread. And what IFS stands for is Eternal Family Systems. And to give you, I'm going to show you a video in a moment that he'll talk about what IFS is about. But just to give you a little bit of background, so Dr. Schwartz was educated in terms of psychology in family psychology. Okay? And what he was trained to do is how to sit a family around the table and to help the family as a whole. And one of the big difficulties with family psychology, as it is with couple psychology, or family therapy, is that you have to be able to handle the various people in the room. And what happens is in a conversation between people is that, let's say you have, for instance, an abusive dad, and the psychologist is trying to get to the bottom of why is this dad abusive? What did you experience in your youth that brought you to where you are today? The children that suffer from the dad are not going to let the dad speak, because when the dad gets a little bit vulnerable, that triggers the children that were hurt by this father. So as a family therapist, you have to learn to ask the children to hold off for a moment, or maybe to leave the room, so you could get further to help the situation as a whole. So you assure them, I'm here for your benefit. You make them feel safe. And when they feel safe, when they trust you, they allow you to open up wounds that they wouldn't do otherwise, and therefore get further. When he did this, he started realizing that this truth of family therapy is also true within a human being, within themselves, meaning that he would find a protective part of the human being. He would find, let's say, a part of the human being that's very, very critical, the critic of the human, and then he would try to understand, why are you so critical about yourself? What happened in your past that makes you so critical? Mm-hmm. And then he would find that he had a hard time getting there because suddenly there were parts of the person that didn't want him to get there. They were like, if you get there, I'm going to get hurt. And he started asking those parts to step aside. He said, if you take a stance on the side, we'll be able to dig deeper into past the critic, realize why the critic is not a critic, really is trying to help you, and then we'll be able to heal you as well. And it's a very vast thing, and I'm going to show you a short video, but one of his main things that he talks about is you have no evil to you. He says, you might be a critic, you might be, someone might be a killer. I don't know. Someone might have really terrible things about them, but really it's only a protective part that's trying to help something else inside. It doesn't mean harm. And if you engage it for what it is, and you recognize the good that it's doing for you, you'll be able to help it and heal it. So let's take a moment to watch this video. And I think that will give us some.
IFS, we think people have parts, and parts are subpersonalities, and in distinction from a lot of other systems, we believe that we're born with them. It's the nature of the mind to be subdivided, that we're all actually multiple personalities, that people who carry that diagnosis aren't any different from anybody in here, except that theirs got blown apart more by the horrific trauma they suffered. But what are called alters in that field are really what we call parts. We call them parts because it's the most user-friendly word. It's not the best word in the sense of being descriptive, but most people don't object when they talk about their problems and you say, oh, one part of you says this, another part says that. So everybody's got parts, and they're all good. They all have naturally valuable talents and resources to lend to us. But as we go through life and encounter traumas and attachment injuries, they shift from their naturally valuable states into roles that sometimes can be quite destructive to us, not realizing that they were roles that were necessary often when you were in the middle of a trauma or had a toxic parent, but they get frozen in that time, and so they think that they still have to do this for you, and often don't even know how old you are. Often, if you were to ask some of these, what we call protector parts, they would think you're still 6 years old, and that therefore they still need to do this for you. So good parts forced into extreme and sometimes damaging roles, hating the roles, would love to get out of these roles. But so that's one basic premise, that everybody has parts, and the goal isn't to get rid of them. The goal is to actually help them transform. One way we do that is called unburdening. So the concept of parts carrying burdens, as defined as extreme beliefs and emotions that came into your system from the outside world through a trauma, through an attachment injury, something like that, and graft onto and attached to these parts, is a key concept in IFS. And drive the operation of the part thereafter, almost like a virus. So the release of these burdens allows parts to immediately transform into their naturally valuable states. And today we're going to be talking about the burden of shame. And I'll be talking about it as actually a multi-part phenomena, that shame is involved with several different parts, and I'll get to that in a minute. But the burden of shame enters us through the external encounters we have, or is transmitted as a legacy burden through our lineage, through our ethnic group, through our culture. The reason, I think it's fair to say that most of the world's problems arise from this misunderstanding about parts and burdens. So when you assume the part is the burden, it makes sense to go to war against it inside. And when you go to war against parts, you go to war against people. So, and most of our field and our culture has assumed that the part was the burden. Does that make sense? Yeah. So this distinction is huge, has huge implications, okay? So parts are stuck in the past, they carry burdens. They also organize to protect each other. So some are in these protective roles, some are very vulnerable and being protected and also locked up for reasons we'll get into. And in addition to all of that, there is what I call the self. And I stumbled onto this just because I was applying family therapy technique and theory to this inner system that my clients were describing to me. And as they did, I was trying to help them, especially after I got hip to the fact that parts aren't what they seem and they actually are valuable. I was trying to help them get along with their parts rather than fight them or ignore them. So I was having these inner dialogues happen, and things would be going pretty well maybe between, let's say, a client and her inner critic, but suddenly she's furious with the critic, and things go south because the critic gets defensive and things aren't going well. And as a family therapist, I was taught when something like that happens, when you're having a dialogue between two people, look around and see if somebody isn't siding with that one of the people covertly. And if you do notice that, ask that person to step back in the room. And so I started to think maybe there is some other part that's interfering in this relationship between my client and the critic. And indeed, I could help people say, okay, let's ask that one who hates the critic to step back. And they would immediately change in the way they looked, even in their face, but also in what they said, in the tone of voice, often in the direction of, I'm just kind of curious about why this part is calling me names all day. Seconds earlier, hated or feared it, that steps back, and it seems to release this other person who not only is curious, but is also calm and confident and often even compassionate to something that they had hated seconds earlier. And as I witnessed that in multiple clients, I got excited at some point. What if that's the core of us? What if that's in everybody? What if simply by opening space, that person comes out and actually not only has these C-word qualities like calm, compassion, confidence, clarity, curiosity, creativity, connectedness, courage. I think we got all 8, right? There are 8 of them. But also had a kind of wisdom about how to heal both internal relationships and external relationships. And it does turn out 30-some years later that is in everybody, and that the simple act of getting parts to open space for it releases it, and that actually does know how to heal, both internally and externally. So that we call the self with a capital S, to distinguish it from the common use of the word self. And so that's the model in about 3 minutes, I think. So, thank you.
So Dick, can you tell us what parts are within the IFS system?
Parts.
Here. Here we go. Okay, so I don't know if you realize where I'm going with this. I think that would be a nice lesson for itself, to talk about who we really are. But my question here is it fair to say that Dr. Richard Schwartz believes in us more than the Alter Rebbe believes in us? When the Alter Rebbe talks about how we have evil parts and parts that are negative, and Dr. Richard Schwartz actually says or suggests that we have no evil. You know, there's the self, which seems to be this like saint, and then we have these parts that maybe are not conducive, but they don't mean harm. They actually mean to help. They actually mean to be helpful, and they used to be helpful, and they were necessary. And if we were only to uncover why they're really there and how they got stuck in their jobs, we would realize that they actually helped us through a lot of life. Is that a fair thing to say? That Dr. Richard Schwartz believes in us more than the Alter Rebbe. And the suggestion that I want to make today, which is why I brought him, is that not only does the Alter Rebbe not believe in us less, but he actually believes in us more. And the fact that he defines evil as ego as evil or self as evil is because he has the liberty of saying that there's more to us than just the self, than just the ego. So where am I going with this?
But there's, like he said, there's a self with a capital S,
Okay.
and that's in my feeling, that self is not the ego. That self is our truth, our essence, our core.
Okay. So I'm going to talk about that shortly now. I have my own ideas of what the self is really about, and maybe that's going to be a further class. We're not going to be able to get that into now. I think that's the third soul, which we're not going to have time for, what's called an intellectual soul. But just on face value, I want to ask you, what do you think if you dug inside, of everything that you did, you asked yourself, well, why did you do that? And about the why, whatever answer you got, you asked yourself why. And you tried to get to the core of things, of what's really driving my system. What am I really about? Why do I live? Or what makes me really happy? What am I really looking for in life, ultimately? I work for money. I have money to support my family. I have a family too. Ask yourself, what are we at our core? God. You say we're God at our core. Okay, that's a saintly answer.
What?
That's a saintly answer.
Well,
That's a capital S.
well,
Okay.
that's yeah, but you see, I'll discuss with you about that, but I think it's also our experiences in life
That.
How do I put this? I mean, that's why I say God, because I believe that whoever your God is, okay, he's in control. And you basically have to then take life and look at things versus analyzing them constantly and going, why? Because it's really why not, and I guess what happened with Philip has totally changed me. And that's going to be that way. But if I look at what happened and I take out the ego, I take out myself from it all and start going to, well, the soul. It makes a big difference as to how everything of how I functioned before versus how I function after. And I'm seeing that a lot of the self and the ego gets in our way.
Okay. Okay. That's very deep, I think.
That's very deep.
What do you say, Gary?
Just, I guess, thinking about what he was saying as far as, it sounds somewhat, I think part of what you said and part of what Dr. Schwartz said was about maybe of these different parts that maybe as you develop and grow older, they develop differently. Maybe some stay like a childish type of a version that protected you from certain things. And even though maybe you've grown up and experienced other things and matured and other areas within you have grown, there could be other parts that have stayed in more of a primitive state that could be holding you back, or could be, controlling or things that you do. I mean, obviously, it's just kind of thinking about it, just even like people who grow up in the same house, they all, interesting how they can all develop and grow up very, very differently with different problems or strengths and weaknesses. And even though you would think all the same factors affect everybody the same way, but I guess they don't, because internally how your brain, your emotions, how you process things, I think, like jealousy and selfishness, I think those are part of probably more of those evil, not evil pieces, but those those negative parts that kind of bring you down or hold you back.
But then you have Richard Schwartz, which is telling us that even jealousy and even ego
The
are,
strength to it, it could possibly.
or they're coming from a good place. They
Right.
mean well.
Right, they're there for, it's probably some self-preservation, some
Exactly.
protection.
Exactly. So you're thinking like a normal human being. You're thinking logically, which is evil is something which is getting in my way. And Richard Schwartz is going to tell you that that's not even evil because really it has good intentions. Well, the Alter Rebbe seems to tell us that our basic instinct of survival is evil, which
It seems like he's saying that even though, right, it might have developed into something to help you in the past, but it might have to be redirected now because it might be holding you back.
correct. Correct. So I want to suggest something, and everyone might argue with me, and we'll see how much this becomes a debate from a class. But my suggestion is I want to just dive into what we saw from IFS and think about what's the driving force behind those parts, and maybe what's even the driving force behind the self, right? So he says that any negative attributes that we might have, whether it's the critic, whether it's the shame, whether it's the ego, whether it's being being controlling or whatever it might be, really they have good intentions. They were there to protect us when we needed them. They were there to help us through a difficult situation. They were here to make sure that we don't get hurt again. What is that really all about? At the end of the day, what's the core of it? What's the basic need? What's the basic want? Like if you asked it, any of those parts in its most vulnerable state, in its most honest state, so what do you really want? If it was all gonna be your way, what do you want? And I think the response would be, I want that things should just be peaceful and happy, and I should be able to just be myself.
Sit on the beach and drink a pina colada.
Exactly. I want to sit on the beach. Exactly. I want to retire. I just want to enjoy life. I want to sit back and relax. I just want to go fishing. That's all I want to do. There's a guy and a rabbi that I know that deals with a lot of teens. So he has this in Australia. He has this line. He always tells them, he's like, you're working so hard in high school to go to uni. They call it, everything is shortened in Australia. So university is uni. So you work hard to go to uni, and you work hard in uni to get a good job. You get a good job to make some money. You get to make some money to ultimately to retire and go fishing. Right? He's like, so just go fishing now.
Yeah.
Right? That's his. But I don't think it's true in America, because in America we don't just want to go fishing. We have bigger ideals that we're aiming for. But in Australia, they're very laid back. They just want a good beer and go fishing. So I think that's a correct thing to say, which is if you dig deep into those parts and take away their evil, take away the parts that are negative, take away the parts that are dark, and say, okay, what are you? What are you about? What's your child about? What do you want? Any child, look at a child. What does the child want? The child just wants to be happy. Playful. No child that's evil. Every child is the best. The child wants love. The child wants to have her or his place, connection, right? So if I were to say it in other words, the child, when you look at a baby, as much as you see the most pure thing in the world, the most, the most sweetest thing in the world, goodness, there's no evil about a child. But what you do see is the height of selfishness. What you do see is the height of only thinking about myself, is nothing else. Very little brains, a lot of emotions. It's about how I feel, right? My needs, very needy, not really thinking about what am I needed for. This is something that we've discussed in the past.
That's self-sufficient. They need people to take care of it.
Right? But a lot of that comes from being self-centered. So if I'm self-centered, I automatically depend myself on other people. If I'm not self-centered, I become much more independent, which is another discussion. I don't want to go into that at length. But if I'm needed, and therefore I'm not self-centered, I'm much more self-sufficient. If I'm very If I'm very self-centered, I'm automatically very needy. I'm very dependent on others because I see everything around me as feeding towards myself. And everything around me, the question becomes, do they accept me or do they not accept me? Are they good with me or are they not good with me? Do they make me feel good or do they make me feel bad, right? Just gonna jump right back to that for a second. That's why the Alter Rebbe puts the emotions before the intellect when it comes to the animal soul. Because when it comes to our need to survive, we're mainly emotional. Our intellect is just there to help us with our emotions, to help us get what we need, to help us survive like the animal. An animal has a survival instinct, and that's all it's about. It's all about survival. Would I say that a lion is not smart? A lion could be a genius when it comes to surviving. Any animal could be a genius when it comes to surviving. But if it doesn't need to survive, it's not going to be a genius. If the animal is happy and satiated and got enough sleep, it's not going to be looking at the water and thinking where the wind's coming from and how fast is the water moving, like a scientist would. Because an animal doesn't have an interest. The interest of an animal is to survive. It's mainly emotional. The intellect is there to serve the emotions. It's a secondary to the emotions. What do you mean by primitive brain?
An animal, the brain that we have is the original primitive brain plus the human frontal cortex thinking, rationalizing, logic, blah, 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 right? The animal
Just has the primitive brain.
Is wired.
Okay, so that's interesting. Maybe we'll have to revisit that in another class. My suggestion is that there's many people, if that's the case, that never really use that front part of their brain. And the reason, not in a bad way, the reason is very simple, because where am I in life? When someone is a doctor for 40 years and they work over hours because they want to make more money, so their main desire is to make it in life, to make more money, which is really, really, settling and sitting in that survival part of ourselves. So we're using a lot of brain cells, but the brain cells that we're using is all from that part of the brain. We're all just trying to survive. We're never thinking hypothetically. We're never thinking just for the sake of thinking, which is why when you sit down in a class like this and the rabbi is talking about something which doesn't seem practical at all, it doesn't seem to help me in life, I shut off. I'm like, I don't know why I'm here because I haven't used that part of my brain for 40 years. Okay, let's get back to our conversation. But again, I think that's another conversation, and a lot of it we're kind of merging the third soul here, which is going to be another conversation. So I'm going to try to just keep it to two souls for as much as I can. Again, so going back to IFS, as much as we suggested that you only have good parts, but what we mean by that is that all you're doing is this sweet child trying to survive. You're not trying to hurt anyone. You're not trying to be a bad person. All you're doing is trying to be about yourself. And there's other things that are getting in the way. There's protectors that are that came up to try to protect you to be yourself, to be selfish, to be egoistic, to survive. And I don't think that's a bad thing. The fact that Dr. Schwartz didn't go any further than that, I don't think is a negative thing, because as far as I'm concerned, psychology can't go further than that. As far as I'm concerned, psychology looks at a person and says, again, like the question I asked you before, what are you at your core? If I were to ask you why, prove to me that there's anything more about you than survival. And if that's all you're about at your core, if at the end of the day, your most core essence, what you want is to live, to survive, that's the thing that you won't give up. If there was one thing in life that you wouldn't give up over anything else, everything else is gone. And there's one choice you're going to make, it's going to be to exist. It's going to be to live. That's my core essence. That's all I want in life. If you can't prove anything more, I can't define that as evil, because that's all you're about at your core. The Alter Rebbe tells us that you have a second soul. The Alter Rebbe tells us you have a second interest in life. You don't only have an interest to survive. On the contrary, your interest to survive is a secondary interest. You might only be aware of that interest, especially if that's the only interest that you've used, that you've exercised, and that's the only interest that you'll be aware of. But in truth, you have a second interest. And that second interest is to connect to God. That second interest is to be part of God, to reconnect to where you came from. Like a flame, says the Alter Rebbe, that doesn't want to be itself. It wants to leave itself. It wants to connect to its source. You have a part of you that feels itself when it puts on tefillin. You have a part of you that feels itself when it lights Shabbos candles. You have a part of you that all it wants to do is not survive, but connect to God. That part of you is the part of you that for all of Jewish history gave its life for God. How do we do that? If you ask a psychologist, you can't jump over your own head. You can do a lot of things, right? The saying says you could jump off the house, you can't jump on the house, right? You could do a lot of things. You could give a lot of yourself, but you can't jump over your own head. At one point, we have a limit. We are who we are, and I can't go past that. Says the Alter Rebbe, a Jew at his core, at his essence, is bigger than himself. Because at his essence, he has a soul which its desire, its purpose, its interest is to connect to God. And with that said, this is going to come back to our previous question that we had at the beginning of the class. Why is it that we define the intellect of the godly soul as understanding God and the emotions of the godly soul as feeling for God? And the answer is, we don't have intellect or emotion. We have a soul. And our soul has capabilities with which it reacts and deals with its surroundings. Now, a soul at its essence is its desire. If my desire is to connect to God, then my intellect, my ability to see things objectively, is only within the framework of my soul, of my core, of my essence. Just like an animal cannot be objective about 2 + 2 = 4, it can only use its intellect in terms of what its core is about, which is survival. So its intellect is geared for survival. It doesn't have intellect. It has intellect to survive. The godly soul has intellect to connect to God. And the godly soul has emotions to connect to God. And the godly soul has thought, speech, and action to connect to God. And when you eat that apple, if you're eating it for the pleasure, then you're only using your animal soul. But if you're eating it to live, maybe we'll talk about that in a different class, that's connected to the third soul. But if you're eating it to connect to God, if you're eating it to have energy, to serve God, because you know that God wants you to live, then that's your godly soul manifesting itself through your animal soul in your action, and eating that apple, and being bigger than yourself. You're connecting to a part of yourself which is more. And that's why the Alter Rebbe has the liberty of saying, now that we recognize that you have a part of yourself which is bigger than the world, bigger than creation, bigger than yourself, I'm going to define self as evil. It doesn't mean it's bad. It talks about in other places. It's fine that we have evil. That's something which the Alter Rebbe talks about later on in Tanya, saying, recognizing that God created us with this evil, with a purpose, with a mission, and it's good that we have evil. And that's, again, another discussion. But he has the liberty of telling us that that's defined as the lower part of ourselves, because there's more. He's introducing something which is so much higher, so much greater than that part of self. And I want to just tell you a story, and then I'm going to take questions. I think you all have questions. There's a story that I wrote about in one of my emails, and I could tell you a million of these stories, but it's just the one that I thought about because I wrote about it. So I walked into the hospital, into the ICU one day because I'm a chaplain in St. Francis, and I come into this, I don't know if I told you this story when we met. So I come into this room, and frankly enough, I like the ICU visits more than the other visits because there's more space and they have more time and they're also more interested in a rabbi. So in any case, but I pray for no one to be in the ICU. So I always leave our conversations by saying, I hope I never see you here again. So I walk into the room of this guy. I never met him before, and he seems to be in his 80s, and he seems to be sleeping. So I walk out, I notice that he's sleeping. I turn around, I start walking out, and then I see him open his eyes. So I start coming back in, and as he notices me, he seems to close his eyes and put his head back down. So I say, I'm not going to disturb you. You're tired. I'll let you rest. You need your rest. And suddenly I hear him say, Retz Yiddish? Do you speak Yiddish? So clearly he's trying to feel me out. He's not sure if he wants to have a conversation with me. So I walk in and I say, wow, what's your background? Where are you from? Sure, I speak Yiddish. Turns out that his parents were in the Warsaw Ghetto, and they left the Warsaw Ghetto because of the war. He grew up in a DP camp, and he knows Yiddish fluently. And his wife doesn't really know Yiddish, so he was very excited to speak to someone that knows Yiddish. And we conversed, and I told him a bunch of jokes, and we had a great time. And then nearing the end of the conversation, I asked him, "Do you want to put on tefillin?" He knew what tefillin was. The last time he put on tefillin was a while ago. And do you want to put on tefillin? And he said no. He very respectfully said, I'm not interested. Obviously, he was hurt. Obviously, he's someone that experienced a lot in his life, and he wasn't ready to do that. So I smiled and I said, well, should we say a prayer together? They said, what? So I said, let's say the Shema together. Shema is the most fundamental Jewish prayer. And very boastfully, he's sitting there. In general, he really had his, aura about him as much as he was in the ICU, but he held his ground. And very boastfully, he says, Shema Yisrael. He starts leading the prayer like he knows it. So I continue leading with him, and I say, I don't know. I say God's name, and I'm waiting for him to respond, and there's no response. And suddenly he burst out crying. He burst out crying, like uncontrollably. And I'm waiting there, and I put my hand on his hand, and and then at one point he just said, he apologized, and I'm sorry, I can't continue. And I excused myself and I left. And I asked you, where is the ego in that story? In terms of the conversation, everything about that conversation was very much regular human conversation, regular self conversation, not in a bad way, just in a very normal way, very human. But then I think I met a part of him that was not human, a part of him that I trembled in front of. I lost myself. There was a part of him that was bigger than the conversation between us. I touched a soul that was deeper than just self-preservation, because we don't break down from self-preservation when we hear the word Shema Yisrael. I suggest, and I can tell you a million stories like this that I have encountered myself, I believe to have encountered a Jewish soul. And I think we all sometimes feel that inside, and sometimes we have a hard time because we feel a mix of our souls. Sometimes we're not sure which soul it is, and that's fine. But then we have moments where we encounter the Jewish soul. And I would argue that the purity of that moment was as pure as a soul giving his life for God. Go back to the time of the Spanish Inquisition, or go back to the time of the Crusades, where a Jew was faced, do or die. And you could have been talking about a Jew that was not religious. You could have been talking about a Jew that did everything in the book against God. The famous story of Matal the sinner. Matal the sinner was in the time of the Holocaust, and within the Jewish community, he was called Matal the sinner. And I don't have to talk about why he was called Matal the sinner, but he was called Matal the sinner. And there came the time that the Germans gathered all the Jews in the synagogue, and they told the Jews that they have to take out the Torah scrolls and stamp on them. And Matal the sinner was the one that stood up to the Nazi officers and said, no way, never, I'm never going to do that. And they shot him point blank. that purity of the soul, I think I encountered there in the ICU. And I think that's something that Dr. Richard Schwartz, with all due respect to him, never has encountered, has never been aware of. There's a part of the human being, the part of ourselves, which is a second soul, has a second desire. It has a different interest in life, not an interest for self-preservation, not even an interest to be happy and that everyone should live peacefully. An interest to connect to God, an interest that's just beyond the human intellect, an interest that's just beyond our world. And that's what I suggest is the I. And getting back to that, our first question, who is the I? That's a decision that we make, right? So that's something that I began with by saying that in life, we make a decision between souls. In life, we could choose to be selfish. We could choose to eat the apple for self-pleasure, for self-preservation, or we could choose to eat it with a higher intent, to connect to a deeper self. And I'm sure when you have a shakeup of losing a child, I'm sure it hits much deeper. We realize that life has to be more about than survival. It has to be about making a difference. It has to be about being here. Yes, very much so. It has to be about, affecting the world, bringing godliness into the world. So that's something I don't blame you for being aware of. But definitely, this is something which we have that choice in life. And the more we exercise our godly soul, the easier, the more natural it will be to live with that and be aware of that in our daily life. Any questions? Any thoughts? Does that sit with you? Does that make sense to
I
you?
was thinking about the story of the man at ICU. I don't think he had no control over that. It just came out in the moment, right?
Sure.
So I don't know how easy not easy at all, but to identify or control that godly soul,
Right.
That's within
that's
us. Where's that? It hasn't manifested itself, or
That's
it's
just
just an underlying.
a great question. Generally, the answer is that it's an underlying thing. We're not in tune with it, and we're not meant to be in tune with it. And the reason why we're not meant to be in tune with it is because God gave us our godly soul within the constraints of our world, within our animal soul, and therefore we're much more aware of our animal soul. And talk about a child, they're only aware of the animal soul, like I mentioned, they're only aware of their need to survive. And as we mature, our godly soul becomes more of who we are. That's why our bar mitzvah is at 13 years old or 12 years old, because only at that age are we more capable of being in tune with our godly soul. As our brain matured, which is where our godly soul rests, it rests in our brain, we have the ability to be more aware of it. But either way, it's always going to be within the constraints of our animal soul. And the reason for that is because the purpose of life is to bring godliness into the world. And that experience of Matal the sinner, or that experience of the guy in the ICU, wasn't bringing godliness into the world. It was escaping reality. Like you said, it was a moment of beyond control. It was illogical. It wasn't manifesting the godly soul. It was escaping whatever he knew himself to be and losing himself in a outer body reality. And then at a later point, he came back to himself and wasn't sure what that was about. And that's not what life is about. Life is about manifesting that. And manifesting that consists of putting on tefillin or studying Torah or thinking about our connection to God. So we're not getting that experience, that wholesome experience, that escape experience, but we're manifesting that part of ourselves, that desire to connect to God in a way that's tangible, in a way, exactly, feeding it. There's a great guy by the name of David Nesinoff, and he's a speaker. He used to be a conservative rabbi. He became very close to Chabad. He has a very long story. He goes around talking. My dad had him once in the synagogue. He's hilarious. He wrote a few books. And when he came to talk at my dad's shul, this is years ago, I was a little kid, and he gave the sermon. And what he spoke about is this television show of these Siamese twins. And he said how there was these Siamese twins, that the whole television show was about them, week by week, analyzing them and talking to them. And you had these dual personalities, and each one wanted something else in life. One of them liked the movies, the other one liked sports. And they kind of had to work with each other, because they were connected. So they said, this week we'll go to the movies, next week we'll go to the game. And he said this was his way of bringing it out, which I thought was very nice. He's like, God says, rest on Shabbat. What does rest on Shabbat mean? Don't use your telephone, don't use electricity, don't drive, whatever rest of Shabbat, all the laws, the do's and don'ts. And he's like, people tell him, well, to me, resting is actually watching television. And resting is actually, going skydiving. Like, why is that considered what you're going to tell me what resting is? And his point was, you never let your godly soul speak. Your godly soul wants to rest. For 6 days a week, let your animal soul do its thing. And 1 day a week, let your godly soul experience itself. And again, this is like, we could talk about this for life. We could talk about this forever, and I'm sure we will. But Chassidus always tells us that our godly soul came into this world with a mission. And it's trapped in a body. It's trapped in this animal soul. And it comes down to this world with the hope that it will have those opportunities to do its mission, because that's the most important thing. But sometimes we don't let it do its mission. Sometimes we just let it be trapped, and that's very painful. That's not a very fun experience for our godly soul. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, somewhat.
Somewhat. Okay, with that said, I want to play another video. Do we have any more questions?
Just something I've been thinking about, but it might be just a silly question. But if obviously God is the giver of life and is within us all, why wouldn't, or is God also within animals as well? I mean, would there be a part of God? Just ask. Just
You've asked them thinking about that in general, or thinking about that in our class?
No, just thinking about it now because what you were saying about us having a godly soul, but you also talking about animals just having just the need to survive, just protection, eat, whatever, survive, whatever threats there are out there. So do you think, or there is not a piece of God in every animal that's out there on the earth who are obviously have souls within them? There's life, right?
Definitely. So
Created
that's
by God, because God, the animals were created first, man was created after, right?
So I think it's a much lengthier discussion, not for 1 minute. Maybe we'll hold it for another class, but I'll just address that for a moment. And if you want, you could text me that, and maybe we'll make a class about that. I think that's a great question. But just to give maybe a 1-foot answer, I don't know if that's going to satisfy you.
I'm not. I know it's much deeper than that. It's just it was just something that came to mind.
Sure. That's a great question. It's a very fundamental question. So the premise would be that let's talk about your thought, speech, and action. So, if you're a businessman and you have business meetings with people and you have interactions. So there's a lot of things that you say in those interactions that don't express your soul, although they came from your soul. So your soul has a certain intent with saying those things. And therefore, if you ask your soul, what's your opinion about those things that you said? Or what's your opinion about, why you put that out there? What do you have in it? What do you gain from that conversation? So your soul obviously has an answer to that question. There's obviously a reason why your soul did that, why you did that, something that you have in it, something that you find beneficial in this conversation. But from an outside look, from an outside perspective, they won't necessarily see that part because you put it out there. It's just a conversation that happened. So not everyone is looking at it from your perspective. And because it's a conversation that happened, so it's not subjective to you. It could be, anyone could take it and make it subjective to them. You follow me?
Sure.
When God created the world, he has an intent for the world. And when he created the animal, he has a reason for the animal. And when he created the animals need to survive, there's a reason. And that reason is much deeper than the animal surviving. that reason is a godly reason. That reason has a godly, purpose. And we know that every single thing that happens in creation, to the finest detail, is all part of that greater mission, that greater purpose, which is why God created it. But not necessarily is that aware of it. Not necessarily are we aware of it, aware of that purpose. If I have the feeling to do good to someone else, I'm not aware that that's part of God's cosmic plan. I'm just aware of my experience of it, of my desire, of what I have in it. And the fact that I'm not aware of it also has a plan, is also because of a reason. Every detail has a reason, which is why it came from God. If it came from God, it obviously has a godly reason. Just like if it came from you, it obviously has a you reason. You obviously have something in it. But when it's out there, you are not necessarily seen in it. Again, there's so much more to say about this, and it's very, very deep. But the premise is that we don't have a godly soul. The premise is that we are our own beings, created by God, and He has a reason for that. But our awareness is of ourselves. To go and tell me that you have more than yourself, that you not only have a reason, a godly reason, but you have a godly personality. You have a godly conscience. You have a part of you that its sole desire is to connect to God, a part of you that would give its life for God, a part of you that views its desires to survive as a limb that's willing to be amputated for a bigger purpose, which is to connect to God. That's very deep, and maybe again, there's a lot being said over here, but the gist of it being that it doesn't conflict each other. Everything has a reason from God's perspective, which is why God created it. But that doesn't mean that we're going to be aware of that reason. And when I say you have a godly soul, that means that you have a part of you which is actually aware of that reason, and not only aware of it, but that's all it's about. That's its personality. So even if our animal soul becomes aware of its reason for existence, which will make it the best animal soul could possibly be, you could purify yourself and make yourself closer to God and make yourself more idealistic and recognize your purpose in life. But that's where it's gonna end. It's gonna end, I'm here and I'm about survival, and that survival has a purpose. The godly soul is not about survival. The godly soul is about God. And that's something which is unique to the Jewish people. It's unique to the Jewish people to tell you God put Himself into this world to bring godliness into this world, to make everything around it aware of its mission and purpose.
Does that mean that my cats have a soul?
They definitely have a soul, but their soul is a soul to survive.
Yes, that's what I've gathered.
Let's watch this, I think, if you don't mind.
And then make it reincarnated.
I think you'll appreciate it if we could see the subtitles. I have to reload the page. I'll open out. Oh, here we go.
It's not playing. It's not moving. Well.
So the words of this melody, which you'll see in a moment, are my soul and my flesh yearn for you. And that's the beginning of it. And then there's a later part to it, which you'll see. So that's a verse in Psalms, and there's other melodies with the same words. But what's unique about this melody is there's a second half. And the second half goes, where in English they sing, hey, Johnny, 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 what are you doing in the market? You don't buy, you don't sell, all you do is trouble. You'll see the actual words in here. The point being that we also have our animal soul, which is just looking to survive, but really that's not what it's about. We came to this world, we came to the market to make money, which is to do mitzvahs, to connect to God, to accomplish something, and meanwhile we just end up looking for self-pleasures and self-preservation, and it's kind of like, what are you doing in the market? You're here to do something and you're not doing it. You're busy with other things.
We are a godly soul who has a human.
Ultimately, you could definitely say that if you identify with that way. That's a high level of identity.
Marko, što ty jedziesz na jarmarko, nie kuplajesz, nie pradajesz, tylko robisz swarko. Ej, ty, dobry nie Marko, što ty jedziesz na jarmarko, nie kuplajesz, nie pradajesz, tylko robisz swarko. Lolos de Wörter messen sich mit Stamale dem Pirush von de Wörter, a das geht auf ein Jetzer Hore, wo sich am Melech Sokin und Xil, wo der Pfarr ruft den Mond Turin, wo das heißt Axil. Und fährt auf Jarmarko, auf ein Jerid, wie es sieht, sich mit Weiher, a der ganze Welt, das wie ein Jerid. Was auf Jerid kommt man sich zuvor nach Feinkäfen Schere und dabei verdienen, worum Sovin wie Sovin Tagre Ikre bit mir, und a sehe sechet, a das, was an Neshome hat man geschickt in der Welt, was die Neshome sich hat zuwe mit Achas Kisse, Hakoved und noch hecher. Wie der Rebbe sagt in Tanya, a Nefesh Hashem ist bei Israel, ich hele kelekami mal mamosh, und hat die Neshome kommt rob dole mato in a guf, in a nefesh abamis und a guf, und hat sie ton mit kol inyoni hoelam. Far was sie das a iride zere chaliye, kedem soll dabei etwas verdienen. Nicht soll sein der Yitzioscho ki biyoscho, worden das nicht maßbig, so wie in Tagro ikre. Sie darf sein an Aliyah in der Nord, wo sie noch früher von Wanetere gekommen, das heißt in poschetere Wörter, an Neshome, wie sie Chatzuwe mit Achas Kisse Hakove, die sie sich achele kelekamimal, Duru, sie ist jede dolle Matto und vernehmt sich Yisho, Achas, Bitshuvo und Meisim Tevim Baelam Hazeh, durch wo das der Miete sie sich mit Male dem Zivu und mit dem Rotzen Habere, ist Char Mitzvah, sie wird nicht Chaber und verreinzigt, mitten Nesen Hatero und mit Zave HaMitzvah, das ist Lishteyove, Begufe de Malke, sie wird Israel, Bekutsche Brichu, wird das Kule Chad. Durch Tshuve und Meisim Tevim verdient man auf dem Jerid, dem Schar HaYeser Godel, dem Revach HaYeser Godel, warum das Revach belig Wuli, die Hisachdus mit dem, was Lemaila Mikol Medidis Vahagbolis, wo das der Rebischter allein. Kedese soll sein, der Verdien soll ankommen mit dem ganzen Geschmack, was sie kann sein, will nicht der Rebesteller soll sein Name, die Ksufa Amatone on Haravanie, ist auf der Rufi do der Omol Bejanki, der Haravanie, was mir gibt jeden. Als Chotscher set zwei Wegen, Hachaim, Vesate, Vesamoves, Vesara, ist von deswegen Ubacharto, Bachaim, macht nicht Kintois und kleibt es dem Derech Hachaim, und Tomeri das verbunden mit Schwierigkeiten und mit Haravani stellt sich nicht ab für Omo. Abi zu eiskleiden und gehen in dem Derech, wo der Rebester will, wo das der Derech hat Teire war Mitzwe. Wie bald der Fahr darf man sich echt haben, einen, was soll zureden, soll das nicht tun, warum man nicht, sich nicht haben, in Haravani hebt sie sein mehr nicht wie Teva allein, wo der Fahre da der Linie von Jezer Hore, was im Massis es Hoodom, als Gedei der Mensch soll basier gefunden in der Kirche, auf nicht zuhören sich zu ihm, und nicht gucken dich auf seine Teine, soll es bleiben in dem Derech HaYoshor, in der Veda, in Limud Atero und in Mekayim sein Mitzvahs. Aber was die Kavone von dem Yetzer Hore, wie sagt in Seher und der Chsides bringt das herab, in der Yetzer Hore allein will, aber soll ihm nicht folgen, warum weiß der Emesse Matore zu dem, was mit ihm gemacht, der soll Reis bringen, die Meile, was da bei Jiden als nicht gucken, die auf Schwierigkeiten tut und das, was der Rebester heißt im Tor. Und demut ist der Yetzer Hore eche dem Schar, was durch Achem ist angekommen an Jiden, nicht aber der Name, die Gsufe, nor hat das Eisgehorvet und verdient Und der Fahrt einigt mir mit dem, als wenn ist mäßig in einem Neffen und mir folgt ihm nicht, in dem hat auch getan, nach Hochmagdela. Wie bald aber als tut und danach folgt mir ihm, mit dem kommt es, als allein hat nicht erfunden, und nicht nur hat nicht erfunden durch den Marker noch verkehrt, hat noch danach absagt, was all Jode ist bot a Kolo Beela. Und hat das die Teine zu ihm, wie bald aber Jiden geschehen dort, der Zomelocho Nafshi Komelocho Psori. Und das, was wir da haben, dem Yetzer Hore, Kedea durch den Ruf soll werden, als Simoin bei Jiden zu dem Ebersten, wie bald gefindt sich bei Ziehe Woje, Bili Moje. Wie Schaß aber mich hinzugekommen zu der Darge von Zomelocho Nafshi Komelocho Psori, demut hat der Duri Marka nicht was zu mischen sagt, war schon seins auch getan, und demut ist mehr nicht was Robisch Svarko aufmachen am Achleikes, ben Israel, wie im Shabashamayim. Und hat das, was mit einigt mit der Simcha, wie bald als schon dort der Linie von Zomelocho Nafshi, Komelocho Psori, demut darf schon sein, der ist Habke Chashechel in Eira, der Bechole Wovcho Bishnei Yetzerecho, der Yetzer Hore soll nicht Robisch Zwarko und soll nicht Tonot Adi Nyonim in der linker Seite, nur soll werden am Messiah, Wahavtes Hashem Elekecho.
Okay. I think that ends our class for today. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Oh, God, thank you.
Is that something that you want? Is that clear? What is it?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Any questions on that? Is that
To me, it sounds like keep remembering who we are.
right? Yeah. You realize what we're really about, why we're really here. Or you were going to say something.
No, I was just still processing what he was saying. Just thinking about it, just the thought of, right, it's just an analogy going to the market, or, buying and selling, obviously buying at a low price and selling at a higher price, but it was relating that to your, I guess, your connection with God, that you should, I guess, by doing mitzvahs or good deeds or what have you, you're filling up, you're raising the value, I guess.
So the question is, why our soul came down to this world? Why did it take the time to come down here when it was up there enjoying God's presence and it was connected to God, and it came down to a world where that connection is not the way it was up there? And obviously the answer is it came down with a purpose. And that purpose is to do mitzvahs, because when we do mitzvahs, we end up being more connected to God than we were before we came down. And the reason is for that because
we're leaving with more than we came.
Exactly. We're leaving with more than we came. And that's the message of the song, saying, if we come down and just play around, fool around, we're not actually leaving with more than we came. It goes back to the analogy I said once upon a time over here, one of these classes, of the guy that, couldn't make ends meet and could never make a living. Anything he did turned sour. And he heard about the island of gold, an island which is just gold. And you could go and, or it was rubies or whatever it was, and you could go and just become wealthy. So sure enough, he gets onto a boat, he borrows some money, and he's like, I'm going to become wealthy, I'll bring back the gold. And when he gets there, there's indeed a lot of gold, and he starts collecting, and he feels great about himself, and he has 2 bags of gold, and he says, I'm hungry. So he goes to the local restaurant, and he sits down for a meal, and he orders the best food because he's wealthy, and the guy feeds him, and he eats, and then by the end of the whole thing, he gets his bill, and he says, don't worry about it, just take this bar of gold, and you could forget about the change. And the guy looks at him and he says, you're crazy, we got all the gold here, this is not currency here. And he says, what's currency? And he tells him, the currency is chicken fat, because that's something which is not very common here, and that's what we do. And I don't got any chicken fat. And sure enough, the guy says, okay, so I guess you're gonna have to clean the dishes to pay off your debt. And he ends up working there for a while, and the story goes, eventually he gets higher in rank, and eventually he becomes the owner of the restaurant after a long time, and he becomes a wealthy man. And at one point he says, I'm so wealthy, I should go back to my family. And he shows back up with a boat full of chicken fat. And they say, it's very nice, but you were sent with something and you came back with nothing, right? And the message is, our soul comes down here because this world is full of gold, full of opportunities to do mitzvahs. And that's what currency is up there. That's what is worth something up there. But in this world, it's worthless. Doing a favor to another person doesn't cost any money. It's worthless.
There's no value on paper.
On paper for doing a favor. My father always says, what we take to our grave is the things that our accountant can't account for. Right? But we invest in all the things that don't have value up there. We end up, because we become distracted and we need to survive, so we end up investing in making a living, or making it, or having pleasures, physical pleasures, which are all things that don't have any currency or don't have any value in a real world. And then when we come back and they say, okay, what did you come back with? You went for all these years and you were gonna, you invested, you came back with something, and we're empty-handed. And it's not supposed to be a sour thought. It's supposed to be a thought of recognizing the value in doing mitzvahs and doing good deeds and being there for other people and making a difference. Okay.
Very good, thank you.
Thank you very much.